there's no shortage of evidence for the Rohingya. 350 villages destroyed from 2017, mostly in a matter of months.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City and points west. These are signs at anti-war protests in New Haven, one organized by Answer, the other by Move On. I spoke at the latter event and called for a big campaign to bring the troops out of Iraq and urged solidarity with the Iranian left, which has been fighting the Soleimani strategy of making Iran a sectarian empire. About the Iraqi situation, their parliament passed a bill calling for withdrawal of foreign forces. Then a Marine general passed a note to their Iraqi counterparts saying the U.S. was going to withdraw. Hours later, that was denied. It was just a mistake. Then the Iraqi prime minister called Pompeo and said he wanted the U.S. to withdraw its troops. And Pompeo told him, no. That puts it all out on the line, doesn't it? After invading Iraq, occupying it for years, hand-making its government, the U.S. high panjandrums just dismiss the prime minister. The U.S. government is an empire. It goes where it wants. It puts troops where it wants. We think the idea of war with Iran or Iraq is very unpopular with American people and call for a serious campaign to bring the troops home from Iraq. This is a garbage dump in Idlib, Syria. Assad or his Russian allies bombed the garbage dump and killed children there who were scavenging. No doubt they were high-value terrorist targets. We stopped the video before the wretched body was carried out. Here's a new song about Syria from Dylan Connor. It starts with scenes of a rescue, which of course is hopeful, but the song's title is If Only You Listened.
Look at me, just a child. Promise me you'll remember my smile. You didn't come when I needed help. Though I am gone, you can save somebody else. If only you'd listen. If only you'd try. If only you'd open your heart and let love start. Saving a life. Reach for me, take my hand. Pull me close and you'll understand. If you hear a child cry when they fall, wouldn't you run to them and answer the call? If only you'd listen. If only you'd try. If only you'd open your heart and let love start. Saving a life. you try. If only you'd open your heart and let love start saving a life. If only you'd listen. If only you'd try. If only you'd open your heart and let love start saving a life. Saving a life. Saving a life. If only you'd listen, you could heal my pain. If only you'd listen, the whole world could change. Open your eyes, start saving a life. Start saving a life. Open your eyes, start saving a life. Whole world could change. Open your eyes, start saving a life. Start saving a life. Start saving a life. Start saving a life. Start saving. All you gotta do is open your eyes. All you gotta do is open your eyes. Start saving. All you gotta do is open your eyes.
Find out how you can help at ifonlyyoulistened.org. In Australia, the news is worse. Just last week, we reported an estimate that 500 million animals had died in the brushfire. Now the estimate is that 1 billion have died. What follows is a few seconds of video of scores of dead animals along the road.
They've broken through the fence here trying to get through, and look at this, it's disturbing. It is really, really disturbing. That is just such a waste. That's just terrible. Like, where could they have gone? These animals, they're nowhere for them to go. And now they're just littered on the side of the road, and they're everywhere. It's very sad.
Most people have no idea how large Australia is. See the map of their country superimposed over the U.S. lower 48. As we record, there is news that the government of Australia has asked 250,000 of its people to flee their homes. Folks, Australia is the canary in the coal mine. The fires there have burnt an area bigger than our state of Indiana, much larger than those awful fires 2 years ago in California. This is a taste of the climate catastrophe awaiting us. And obviously, another frack gas power plant should not be built in Killingly, Connecticut, to release more climate warming greenhouse gases. Now, from a talk a month ago at Yale University about the mistreatment of Muslims in Burma, Adem Carroll of the Burma Task Force.
It takes a lot of bravery to speak about the suffering of your people. I'm not in that same position. I'm American Muslim, Irish American. Of course, in 150, 200 years ago, the Irish were treated in a similar way by the British, up into and through the Great Hunger, where there was forced starvation of the population. And so we've seen that genocide exists as a tool of state repression that unfortunately is still with us now, often with an economic agenda behind it. But yes, it is about hate, and our two speakers are very inspired by the suffering of their families and their people, and it's a huge challenge in both cases. The NGO that I work with is called Justice for All, and it mainly focuses on Muslim minorities that are persecuted. We do have a fair amount of interfaith projects, but our main focus these days is on the Uyghur and the Rohingya, and also, though I won't be speaking about it today, on Kashmir. So these minority communities, and I'll try not to repeat what was said earlier, but maybe reflect on some of the themes that are arising and the similarities. There is a need to organize and to, on a grassroots level, and reach media and policymakers in Washington and at the UN. We're all very frustrated by the lack of support in the international community. At the UN, in both cases, both for the Uyghur and for the Rohingya, China has been blocking action in the Security Council, the UN Security Council. In Congress, there's more complicated dynamic. Just a few days ago, the Uyghur bill passed in the House. It had already passed in the Senate. Now these two bills have to be reconciled, and our advocacy at the moment is to convince the caucuses to use the strongest bill, which is the House bill, and then send it to the president to sign. The president speaks out against China, so we hope that he will sign this bill, but you just never know with the president. So there's a lot of concern, but at least there's some traction. But the bill in the Congress for the Rohingya, on the other hand, faces an even steeper slope, because while the Democratic House has passed a series of bills, including one that calls the situation a genocide, that's a resolution. But a bill including funding for humanitarian work and so forth has passed the House, but has been stuck in the Senate because of Mitch McConnell, who asserts that he's a personal friend of Aung San Suu Kyi and doesn't want to endanger her hold on power. So this is a difficult situation. We are hoping to dislodge him from that narrow-minded position and get him to focus on the fact of genocide. Now, the genocide, or rather the systematic destruction of Uyghur Muslim culture, this is an image of the Keria Mosque, I believe, and I believe this is one of them that's been bulldozed. Satellite images exist showing and documenting the destruction of not only hundreds of mosques in Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, but also historical neighborhoods, cemeteries, and so forth. There's no shortage of evidence. Similarly, there's no shortage of evidence for the Rohingya. 350 villages destroyed from 2017, mostly in a matter of months. As Brother Osama was saying, there have been cycles of destruction and dislocation, mass atrocities before. But just counting from now, we have hundreds of mosques burned, historical places destroyed, and a rewriting of history to discount the Muslim presence. This part of the world has always been pluralistic, and instead it's being reframed as a pure Buddhist state. Now, unfortunately, not everyone would like this headline, "The Face of Buddhist Terror," but this is the politicization of Buddhism. It's a nationalist form of Buddhism. And this is Uratu, who is one of the architects of this policy. Going back, this is Chen Guangguo, who is one of the main architects of the policy to really erase the Uyghur and to force them into these re-education camps that was described. Now, this is making minorities into non-persons, and unfortunately this happens elsewhere around the world, but it's stated. In Burma, the Burmese military is called the Tatmadaw, and these are their goals, to really, the Burmese are inherently Buddhist, and Burmanization is about excluding all the other minorities from citizenship. The Uyghur are also non-persons, certainly, and have disappeared into these great gulags, as we've seen in the past in China as well as in Soviet Russia. So now, repression, concentration camps, a whole map of surveillance, it links to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the Chinese plan for economic expansion that includes over 60 other nations, many of whom have become indebted to China through infrastructure development projects. One thinks famously of certain ports in Sri Lanka that now are totally owned by China because of this debt diplomacy. So China has been very clever about, including in Burma, to gain political power through economic development. And because this so-called Belt and Road runs right through Xinjiang, where the Uyghur live, there's a real incentive to lock down control of all the national resources. In Burma, too, the gas pipelines that run through Rakhine State, as well as through some of the other ethnic minority areas, are a fundamental reason for this command and control repression policy. And people are profiting. Millions and millions of acres have been seized. What happens to the villages after they're burned and bulldozed? They're seized by local military-affiliated mafias. The military in Burma is heavily involved in the black market economy, has been for decades, and they profit off of all of this. They don't get taxed. Military has full impunity because they don't have to pay, they aren't paid by the civilian government, they pay themselves through their own industries. It's a totally has a lack of accountability. So as mentioned earlier, there have been other waves of killing, but again, and all of these numbers have increased in all of our slides. They're greater than than they're listed. But and again, partly it's a union of military mafias and Buddhist nationalists who, as you can see in this slide, can fill a stadium. And they will, unfortunately, organize now in advance of the elections in 2020 in Burma, and in advance of Aung San Suu Kyi appearing in the courts. They're going to make this a big moment to rally around nation and Buddhism. The hatred is carried forward by the use of Facebook, which is the primary way that the internet is used and experienced in Burma. And it took over 4 years for Facebook to begin to shut down the hate sites. There have been civil society groups that I know who have been trying, we've also been trying for years to get them to take action, and it took about 4 years. However, it's very easy to open up a new website, move on, And so, unfortunately, Facebook continues to spread hatred in Burma, and yeah, it's a huge problem. And at the same time, critics of the regime, of Aung San Suu Kyi herself, are thrown in jail. And so human rights activists who thought she was a human rights icon are very disappointed. Instead, we're getting the growth of the security narrative, which in this cartoon shows the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the NGO community, all as roots for terrorism, right? And there exists militias in all these ethnic minority states. The one that exists in Rakhine State, the one that belongs to the Rohingya community, is tiny compared to the other militias in Karen State, in Kachin State, in Shan and Mon, and all the other states. And in Rakhine State itself, the large militia is actually a Buddhist militia, which has been fighting a real violent conflict with the central government. It is not the Muslim, but the Muslim threat is part of the narrative, just as it feeds on images of ISIS elsewhere, and it's manufactured as a threat. What percentage of the total population of Burma is Muslim? You know, less than 5%. And now that most of the Rohingya were only half of that, 2%, and now most of them are chased out into Bangladesh and other countries, and so you've got a tiny fraction of the total population that are Muslim, but they're still being depicted as a major threat. Business must go on, and the arms trade continues to provide arms and weaponry to the Burmese military. Some of nations like Israel claim that they're no longer doing it, but it's not quite clear, frankly. Russia and China are major, and India are major arms dealers to the military. U.S. not, but it's definitely been a major problem, and U.S. doesn't fully want to disengage financially. We're worried that if we disengage, our government thinks that we'll just chase them into the arms of China, but it's frankly too late for that. Aung San Suu Kyi will be meeting with the Chinese government before, or rather on her way to the courts next week. It's on her schedule. She's going to meet and discuss policy. She's very much informed by the Chinese political agenda. So just to say that, yes, there's over 1 million Rohingya in the camps in Bangladesh, and the conditions are getting much worse. As was mentioned, many of them are facing forced removal to Basan Char. This is an overhead satellite image. Also, it sinks into the water for half the year, so it's very inappropriate and very isolated. This is the international trend, is to isolate refugees. And frankly, U.S. refugee policy is also disgraceful, and both our speakers are facing the challenge of being a refugee in this country or trying to be recognized as such. So repatriation must be linked to restoration of Rohingya rights and property. But Aung San Suu Kyi instead is making claims that, sure, anyone could come back, but the reception centers that have been built by Chinese funding are going to be just another form of prison camp. There is no freedom of movement. There are checkpoints everywhere. Rohingya are not safe. They have no rights. There is nothing to come back to. But they want to go back with their rights. So just really briefly to wind up, the UN and US governments have created some mechanisms. Skipping to the second paragraph, there's a fact-finding mission that just wound up. It has led to the formation of a special mechanism that will document atrocities. These will supply data and evidence to the court cases that have been mentioned. The court cases are in the International Criminal Court and now the International Court of Justice. The difference is that the criminal court is something that only can focus on the mass displacement of Rohingya. The criminal court, the Court of Justice actually is bringing up the charge of genocide. And that is the first time since the 1990s that that court has heard the charge of genocide. And the public hearings will be starting quite soon. Fatima Bensouda has made sure that these concerns are being considered in some way in the International Criminal Court. These court cases take a long time, right? And so this brings hope of accountability, eventual justice, but it's not going to be overnight for sure. There are heroes at the UN. Special Rapporteur Yang Hee Lee is a hero. She's banned from going to Myanmar for her troubles. Special Envoy to Burma plays a more inside game.
Mazen Kamsia will be speaking 3 times in Connecticut next week. See thestruggle.org for details. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.